A couple of days ago, I was in my room doing some homework when I looked up and saw a poster that I had put up nearly 6 years ago, and I realized something interesting. I realized that every single player on this poster, besides the goalkeeper, was now gone from Barcelona, which was kinda crazy. I mean, besides Denis Suarez, every single player here spent a minimum of 6 years with Barca, regardless of their performance, age, or contract. I mean, could you imagine the chances of an NBA team fielding a lineup of players who had been on the team for at least 6 years? That would be almost impossible. And it led me to the idea that sparked this video, which is, how important is it to draft well? Think about it. Just 3 years ago, the Warriors used the second overall pick to draft James Wiseman, and along with the returning Stephen Clay, they were gonna dominate the NBA. Well, 3 years later, he's on the Pistons, and nobody really seems to care or notice. You get my gist? It seems there's so much player movement that most draft picks don't really deserve that much hype because they'll probably just be traded away within a couple of years for some other free agent. Well, if you don't feel like watching the rest of the video, I'll go ahead and answer the question for you. I was wrong. Here's a graphic of every team that won a championship in the past 2 decades of basketball. And here are the players from each starting 5 that was drafted by that team. Yeah. You don't need to just draft well, you need to draft exceptionally. The difference between drafting a Tyreke Evans and a James Harden could be a trip to the finals. And the difference between drafting a James Harden and a Stephen Curry could be a potential 4-ring dynasty. So long story short, you need to hit the jackpot to win championships. But at the same time, for every team that wins a championship, there are also 31 teams that don't. And I was curious as to, on a randomly selected team, the amount of draft picks that would end up as a James Wiseman, or a Stephen Curry, or somewhere in between. So I did some research, and what I found was pretty interesting. But let's do some simple math real quick. The average age that an NBA player peaks is around 27, but for our purposes, we'll call it 26, just to include any early bloomers. The average age that an NBA player gets drafted is 20. So that means that by year 6, a player who gets drafted is properly developed for the team that drafted them. And when you look historically, a lot of this data backs it up. And after looking through every single draft pick for the past 2 decades, I found the players that have accomplished this semi-difficult feat. But before I give the answer to you, try to predict yourself how many draft picks have made it to year 6. Remember that there have been 1,200 players to have been drafted in the past 2 decades, and to make it into your 6th year for a team, you just have to play out your 4-year rookie contract and then get a contract extension. 118. Out of the past 1,200 players to have been drafted, 118 have played 6 or more years for the team that drafted them. Now, when I got this result, it was actually pretty spot on with what I expected. Not so low that I would be shocked, but low enough that it backed up the large amount of player movement in the league. However, if we get a look deeper, there are some pretty interesting insights. The first of which is the fact that second round draft picks are damn near useless, unless you hit the jackpot of jackpots. Out of the 450 second round draft picks, there were only 16 who managed to play 6 or more years. Most notably are Nikola Jokic, Draymond Green, DeAndre Jordan, and Monte Ellis. But besides those guys, literally 97% of second round draft picks don't even last till their 6th year. Now, when you move up to the first round, things get a little bit more interesting. Now, if you have any notion of common sense, then it would be obvious to assume that higher draft picks result in better players, and better players typically stay on their team for longer. And none of this was better represented than with the first overall pick, because out of the 15 eligible first overall draft picks, a total of 11 of them lasted for at least 6 years. So despite the many busts that we focus on, the first overall draft pick is still far and away the best you can get. But as we move downward, the data wasn't necessarily linear. Rather, it almost separated itself into 2 tiers, picks 2 through 12 and 13 through 30. And I say tiers because the data within tiers seem to show no logical pattern. Take the second overall pick, for example. Any person, whether it is a casual NBA fan, professional analyst, or your own 5-year-old, would say that besides the first overall pick, the second overall pick is the greatest. I mean, in the draft there is typically enormous buzz surrounding which players will take up the top 3 slots. The second overall pick is expected to become a superstar. And yet, out of the 15 drafts analyzed, 11 of these players were traded away within their first 6 years, most of them during their rookie contracts. I mean, that's insane. Literally every single one of these players was gushed over by scouts, glazed by analysts, said that they had the intangibles, the mentality, the potential. And yet 73% of them were gone before I could even finish high school. And yet scroll down 9 spots to the 12th overall pick, and you find that there are 6 players who lasted 6 or more years for their team. Now it is true that even among these players in the chart, the higher picks tend to be the superstars, but even that's up for debate. And while the first tier of picks had around 46 players each, there was a significant drop-off with picks 13 through 30, these ranging around 1 to 3 players. Fun fact, the 8th, 16th, and 24th pick have been historically bad in the 21st century, and there are basically no superstars that you'll find here. But although your chances are low in this tier, it is still very possible to get a success, especially when in search of solid role players. So, after looking through all these numbers, I think that there's 3 things that we can really center on. The first is the fact that hitting the jackpot is often more important than drafting well. Sure, it's cool to draft a player and have him put in a good shift for your organization, but it's really that top 1% that not only wins a championship, but wins it over and over and over again. 2 is that next time you look at the draft, don't get too down over getting a low pick or too happy about getting a high one, because a 12th overall pick may actually be better than getting a 2nd overall pick. And 3rd is that if you're an NBA player who just got drafted, please do not buy a house, because history shows that you'll probably need to sell it within a couple of years. But you're also a millionaire, so I guess it doesn't matter. Anyway, that's all I got for today. Thanks for watching.